Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Underground. This is part 2 of this week's Intel update, in which I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Chinese-Russian bomber incident that occurred a couple of days ago. This is going to be a little bit more of an informal, sort of below-the-tear-line look at some of these data points, and just, me tossing out some theories. None of this is going to be really confirmed or certain to any degree, so just please take everything I say with a huge grain of salt. I may be all washed out, I may be all wrong on all of this, but I did want to kind of share some ideas, because if I'm right, if these points are, somewhat watertight, this could have some widespread implications. So, just for those of you who don't know, China and Russia conducted a joint bomber sort of mission off the coast of Alaska in the Bering Sea a few days ago. Now, why does this matter? Well, for me personally, I really don't care about the Russian side of things. And why is that? Well, Russia does this all the time. Russia does this on every major holiday. They fly their long-range bombers off the coast of Alaska, off the coast of California. They love doing this. What fascinates me is a very, very tiny detail, and that is that China did it. The Chinese conducting such a flight is very interesting because of the bombers that they have. Russia, primarily for their long-range strategic bombers, uses the Tu-95 platform. Back in the day, some of you might have heard this referred to as the Tu-95 Bear H. It's really the Tu-95M or MS variant. But, most of us who have kind of worked around this in the career field still call it the Tu-95 Bear H variant. That's kind of the workhorse nuclear bomber, Dr. Strangelove kind of aircraft that Russia uses for long-range bombing and for launching cruise missiles as well. There are many other variants of Tu-95, and they have some other ones like Tu-142s. However, for the most part, Russia uses a Tu-95 platform for a lot of presence patrols and things like that. And the Bear H's range is thousands of kilometers. Like, it's a really big platform. As a matter of fact, the Tu-95, I don't know if it was the Bear H variant. I can't quite remember. But a few years ago, in 2010, there was this big sort of, I don't want to call it a scandal, but it was like a news story for, in the community for like months, which was a global flight. And they will do this every now and then. They will refuel this aircraft like 5 or 6 times in the air so that Tu-95 can fly over pretty much every ocean in the planet and just do a global flight. It takes 48 hours to do, like 48 hours to do. And, they sleep on board the aircraft. This is a long range kind of thing. The United States has similar capabilities with the B-2s and now the new B-21s, but let's just talk about Russia for right now. The reason why I don't really blink an eye at Russia doing this is because, well, Russia has, again, like I mentioned, done this routinely since the Cold War, really since the end of World War II they've done this. So it's not really interesting. It's kind of like a sort of like, hey, we know what you're doing sort of thing. They love doing it on July 4th. They love doing that, flying off the coast of California. They love to do it for major holidays, and they love to do it when the United States is experiencing some strife. Really as a way of kind of like a tongue-in-cheek Cold War reference, but most of the time it's operational readiness too. So, for instance, when Trump got shot, one of the very first things that I did was check the BearNet to see if Russia's putting up some Tu-95s, to see if they're putting up some bombers to come take a little peeky peek off the West Coast. They love to do this, and it's just one of those strategic things to be aware of. So far, it's one of those unicorn things. It has never been nefarious. It has always been a training exercise, but that's how strategic warfare works. The very minute that is not a training exercise, you should have paid attention, right? Now, where all of this captures my interest is the Chinese. The Chinese don't have the Tu-95. They have an old Russian bomber called the Chinese call it the H-6, the H-6 bomber, and it's really the old school Tu-16 from the Soviet Union days. The Chinese, this is their main workhorse of a bomber. Here's the whole crux of me talking about this more in depth than I think anyone really cares to follow. And that is, it's not really a long-range bomber. The range of the Tu-16, the new H6 variant with the new engines the Chinese slapped on it, it has nowhere near the range of the Tu-95. So, you might ask yourself, why does this matter? Well, geography. Geography matters quite a lot. But before we get into the geography side of things, let's take a look at the platform that actually flew. This is a screen grab from the Chinese state media and Russian state media publications, the propaganda videos they did on this drill. The United States does exactly the same thing, but this is what the Chinese and the Russians put out. This is actually more specifically from the Russian video, which has a slightly better quality. Now, one of the things you might be asking yourself, if you're thinking along the lines of like a warfare sort of thing, is, okay, what's the range of this bomber? Well, I think the question to ask first is, what variant of bomber is this? This is the H6 bomber. Yeah, okay, fine, but what variant? And here's where things get a little sketchy and where things get, my theory comes out of the woodworks. The Pentagon, or rather NORAD, put in their disclosure of this event that it was two H6 bombers. The Chinese and the Russians said it were two H6 bombers. But what variant? No one has stated. However, if you look at this aircraft, you can tell, at least from what I can tell, my own little research, is that this is the K variant. This is not the long-range variant. This is the standard variant that China has been pushing for a while now. The reason being is that there's no refueling probe out the front of this aircraft. Now, just as a very, very brief side note, it's important to recognize the history of this airframe. Again, this is essentially a heavily modified Tu-16 bomber, Badger bomber, from the old days of the Soviet Union. So for those Tom Clancy fans out there, when they say Badger bomber, that's what it looks like. That's what this is. The difference being, and this kind of goes way back, way down deep into some Cold War ideology or Cold War-like theory, is for a while there, it was not really certain as to if the Russians had the ability to air-to-air refuel this aircraft, because it didn't have a refueling probe on the nose. Well, the Ruskies, being kind of clever, or so they thought, they put on their Tu-16s back during the Cold War years, what these aircraft are based on, that original airframe had the capability of air-to-air refueling using a wingtip-to-wingtip system, which was dangerous as all get out. So basically, aircraft would fly up, one would fly in front of the other, release kind of a drogue chute from this one. It would capture the probe on the wingtip of the second aircraft, and then they would kind of do this sort of like jump rope sort of thing and hope they all don't die and rip each other's wings off. The Russians did this extensively back in the day, and they got really good at it. They could do it at night and all that kind of stuff. They were combat ready, and then they, at least the theory goes, they all stopped it because they realized they're all going to die. So the question remains, when the Russians sold those aircraft that had that system to the Chinese, what did the Chinese do with it? Well, in the open source world, nobody really knows. Theory being, they probably have the ability to air-to-air refuel this aircraft, this H6K variant, but if they do, nobody knows how they do it, at least in the open source world. I'm sure the Pentagon already knows, but just me theorizing, I'm looking at this aircraft, and there is no way that wingtip has the old Russian system. I'm looking at the nose and saying, there's no refueling probe there. Now, that brings up another question. What if it's a retractable probe? Yeah, they could do that. They could have a retractable probe. That's possible. But I don't know if that, I don't know. I don't know. There's no real tell. The other images don't seem to be high quality enough to tell one way or the other. But I have all this digression just to kind of answer the question, what is the dang range of this aircraft? Not theoretically, like what is it really? Because this matters a lot for what I'm getting ready to get into with the geography. The reason that these questions remain is because a variant of the H6K, I think they call it the H6N, the Type N variant, that does have that air-to-air refueling capability. I think they've been trying to kind of cross-coordinate that with their nuclear-capable variant, which obviously has a longer range. So, if this is the standard H6K, and that's a big if this is an H6K and it is not capable of aerial refueling, that raises some questions. And here's why. Let's go to what the range of this aircraft is. Now, again, there's discrepancies here. Generally speaking, if you want to know anything about any sort of military hardware in the world, just as a little fun fact for you, go to what the analysts love and hate, the WEG, the World Equipment Guide. This is something the Army puts together on all the platforms of military hardware around the world. Now, I say that there's a love-hate relationship with this platform because, or with the WEG, because it both is helpful and it also sucks like a lot for some platforms, and it has basically no information. So, one of the discrepancies here that I'll highlight is the discrepancy of what the range of this aircraft actually is. The unclassified WEG that you can get to, I think, is wrong, and here's why I think that. Taking a screenshot from Encyclopedia Britannica, which again is not entirely a reliable source on a lot of things a lot of times, but they say that the aircraft has a range of 7,200 kilometers. Now, this is important because of what the WEG says. There is a difference, and this should probably be just basic knowledge. There is a difference between range and combat radius. There's a difference between radius and combat radius as well. But the range of an aircraft is how many miles or kilometers that aircraft can fly from takeoff to landing. Okay, that is the range of an aircraft. Okay, the radius of an aircraft is how far away that aircraft can travel before having to turn back around and land at the same spot again. The combat radius is the same sort of thing, but with a fuel reserve. So how far going around to the point of return, and then having a small reserve to hang out there at that point of no return if they have to, right? The hunt for Red October all over again, right? It has nothing to do with international law, just kind of explaining the scene in the Hunt for Red October. It has everything to do with procedures on board the aircraft carrier, because it's very dangerous to fly out to your point of no return, hang out there for a few minutes because you're burning into your reserve. You got to come home because by the time you get back to the carrier you just took off from, you're on fumes, and you don't want that. So, when it comes to this bomber, we've got range and we've got combat radius. It is important to remember the difference, because Encyclopedia Britannica, it makes no mention of the combat radius, so we're just going to assume that 7,200 kilometer range that they said is its range, how far it can fly in total before having to land again. So we just divide that by 2 and then subtract a little bit for a combat radius, but I'm just going to call the combat radius of the Tu-16, the original aircraft this H6 was based off of. I'm just going to call the combat radius of that 3,100 kilometers. That's technically the radius, but still. We're going to be the most forgiving here. This will all come together here in a moment. Now the WEG, our fantastic tax dollars have gone into this, and they have actually separate categories for the range and the combat range. And they're the same. Technically, that's not possible, so this is wrong. I already know right off the front this is wrong. It says here in the WEG that the range of the H6, the Chinese bomber, is 6,000 kilometers. So comparable to what the Tu-16 was. It makes sense, right? It's the same exact aircraft, only the difference being is the engines. Now, the engines, of course, are what makes the range different, so it's interesting that the Chinese, according to the WEG, which I think is wrong, according to the WEG, the Chinese put less efficient engines on it than the Russians had. That's not true. The Chinese upgraded it, right? So it's obviously their range is way more than 6,000 kilometers. But let's just keep that for now. The WEG also says the combat range of this aircraft is 6,000 kilometers. So the same exact thing. So somebody forgot to divide by 2 on this. So really, all of this is to say that the Chinese H-6 bomber, the K variant that flew off the coast of the United States, off the coast of Alaska, has a combat radius of 3,000 kilometers. I know that this is an assumption. Okay, I know that this is an assumption, but we have to go with this for now. The reason that I go with this assumption, and here's a little bit of more amplifying information, if you will. Here is a news article from the South China Morning Post, so your localized propaganda for the Chinese theater. This was written in February of 2023 and was an article highlighting the H-6K bomber specifically, and the extreme long-range patrol they had just conducted. So they actually interviewed the squadron leader, right? Chen Xiao, right? Or however you say his name. So they actually interviewed a primary source, and that primary source, again, propaganda probably, but that primary source stated that they flew more than 5,000 kilometers in one patrol around the South China Sea. So that's the total range they flew. So if we come back to our map here, this means that they took off from somewhere, probably one of the southern air bases here, and they did some loops around the South China Sea before landing back at the same place. They didn't just fly a straight line distance away, turn around and come back. They didn't do that, right? Really no aircraft does that, but still. So this article is sort of confirming what we know, that the standard range, again, this guy sort of led on as to what the Chinese considered to be their combat radius, which is 2,500 kilometers. But it jives with what we already know. Encyclopedia Britannica says the range of the Tu-16, the old busted Soviet airframe, was 7,200 kilometers. Okay, the WEG says it's 6,000, and China says that in an operational capacity it's 5,000. So we're talking in the ballpark here of what the range of this aircraft is. Okay, do you see maybe where we're going with this? Assuming that this information is somewhat correct, I would assume that the discrepancy between the 5,000 and 6,000 figure from the Chinese and from the WEG is, one, the WEG is probably out of date by a little bit, and also the pilot is probably considering an extra 1,000 kilometers as a good combat sort of fuel reserve. And also the pilot's probably lying, because if you're a pilot and you want to bomb a target 10,000 miles away and you're being interviewed, you want to say, oh, my plane can fly 9,000 miles. So that person standing at that 10,000 mile mark says, hey, you're 1,000 miles short. So the pilot could be lying as well. But in any case, we're in that range of, we're in the ballpark of 2,500 kilometers to 3,000 kilometers ish, being the combat radius of this aircraft, meaning that aircraft can take off from an airfield, fly 3,100 kilometers in one direction in a perfect straight line, and then turn around at that point and then come directly back, and they will have exactly zero fuel left. That's where we're going. So why does all of this matter? Why is it worth talking about this so much? Well, let's jump to Google Earth and I'll show you why. Remember those numbers that I told you earlier. So looking at Google Earth, let's look at the Pacific theater a little bit. We've got China right here, we've got Japan, we've got the Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia, and we've got where the bombers flew. Now again, we don't know exactly where they flew in this area, but we do know, the Chinese have stated, and the Russians have stated, and the Americans have stated, all three sources have stated that the Bering Sea was flown, parts of the northern Pacific, okay, down here south of the Aleutian Islands, I am assuming, and also parts, let's see if I can get it to focus here, probably not, classic Google Earth not loading, but part of the Chukchi Sea up here in the north part of Russia. So, pretty good flight, right? So looking at the photographs of the exact aircraft that flew, we can see that one of these aircraft has a tail number visible, and this tail number, from my own very limited research, can be associated with the 10th Bomber Division at Luhe Air Base here in northern China. Makes a lot of sense, right? This is one of the most northern bases that they have for their strategic bombers. Now for Russia, things are really, really easy. One, because they showed us the airfield. They showed us exactly through the nose of the aircraft what the pilot saw when he was landing, and that looks exactly like Ukrainka Air Base. If we zoom in here, I can show you very clearly Ukrainka Air Base. So fairly standard. You can also associate the all the markings on the aircraft, the livery, you can associate all of that with, I can't remember which unit it is from Russia, but anyway, the Russian part's easy, okay? Because these bombers are only here at Ukrainka or at Ingalls, I believe. So, yeah, the Russian part's easy. The Chinese did not show us where they took off or landed from in their propaganda videos, as far as I know. And this matters a lot because of what I'm getting ready to do right now, which is show you the range. So let's go ahead and take our little circle ruler tool here, and let's drop it over Luhe Air Base. Let's assume that they took off from there. Well, knowing what we know about the combat radius of that aircraft, let's say 3,000 kilometers-ish, that right there, my friends, is how far they could fly in a straight line in any direction from this airbase. Do you maybe see where the problem lies? Bottom line, I don't think these aircraft launched from China because, well, it just doesn't seem like that's possible. So let's just say worst case scenario. Let's just double it. Let's just double it for fun. Even if the Chinese did like a Doolittle raid and they flew their aircraft in one direction and crash landed them in the Pacific, they could barely get there on fumes if you doubled their range. So I don't think it's possible. If China used the air-to-air refueling version of this platform, I have seen a lot of very wildly differing numbers on that. But I would say that even if the Chinese flew the air-to-air fueling capable bomber aircraft, meaning that what they did was they took off from their airfield and got up to altitude, met up with a tanker up at altitude, and that tanker topped them off. And then maybe, once they got to the edge of their range, another tanker topped them off again. All possible. This is what the Russians do, the Americans do. Every country with air-to-air refueling capability does this. So it would not be out of the ordinary. I'm just saying I don't think it's possible because of the platforms they used. And also, it would make very little sense for China to fly a refueler all the way off the coast of Russia up here. The Japanese didn't scramble, so what I think happened is this. I think the Chinese took off from Luhe Air Base a few days before this, and they flew all the way to Ukrainka and refueled, and probably stayed there for maybe a day or so waiting for weather. And I think that once they were at Ukrainka, moving our range circle here again to be a little bit more accurate, I think they flew from Ukrainka all the way to, once they refueled, they flew all the way to Anadyr. Now again, the combat range of this aircraft being 6,000 kilometers, means that Anadyr was well within range. So here's what I think happened based on purely mathematical evidence. No evidence supports my theory here except for my own math, which is based on premises that are assumptions. So you see what I say, that take all this with a grain of salt? I think what happened is this. I think the Chinese from their 10th Bomber Division took off from Luhe. I think they flew to Ukrainka first. Maybe they flew all the way to Anadyr. I don't know. I probably would have flown to Ukrainka first because the weather around this part of the country this time of year is not great. So they probably flew to Ukrainka, landed, maybe linked up with the bears that are there, maybe had a little bit of team building, you know, and then they continued on to Anadyr Air Base. Anadyr is another, it's not Anadyr Air Base. Everybody calls it Anadyr, but it's really Ugolny Air Base in the city of Anadyr. It's really confusing because there is, if I remember correctly, there are a lot of military installations throughout Russia that are named Anadyr, so excuse me for referring to that incorrectly. It's technically Ugolny Anadyr Air Base. So anyway, that's what I think happened. And on the day of the flight, what I think happened is the Russian bombers took off, probably flew all of this way here, all the way probably to Ugolny Anadyr, where their fighter escort took off. Now again, that's another major thing to keep in mind, is they, in their propaganda photographs and videos, they had fighter aircraft. They had Su-30s, and they had an Su-30, at least one, they had one Su-35, again, at least one. Both of those aircraft have roughly the same range as the H-6. Isn't that weird how that works out? So I think what happened is the fighters, the fighter jets, the Russian escorts, just going all the way back to World War II, things have changed very, very little. You have your bombers stationed way back behind your lines. They take off, they burn a lot of fuel, and when they get over the city of Anadyr, there's a refueler there waiting for them, along with their fighter escort, because their fighters have smaller fuel tanks, obviously, and a shorter range. So everyone links up. They all form up at Anadyr, and then they're off to the races to do their nice little drill here. And you can see that if I drop that 3,000 kilometer ring, that combat range around Anadyr, you can see how much range the Chinese had. If indeed they did stage there, you can see the range that they had. They could have flown a very, very long way. And then from that, let's just go, just purely theoretically, just to show you what all of this is about. Let's go right here. And let's put, well, first of all, let me go ahead and save that just to have it there. And let me draw another one. Let me draw another range ring here of 2,000 miles, which is roughly what the Chinese have as far as their conventional cruise missile. This isn't their nuclear stuff. This is just conventional. The nuclear stuff obviously would have a longer range because it's a smaller warhead, or lighter warhead. But you can see if the Chinese flew in a straight line over Alaska to their absolute maximum combat range and launched their missiles at the U.S., they could hit Washington and Oregon and Northern California and Idaho and places like that. Now, again, this is all theoretical. It's all war gamey kind of stuff. But I thought this was interesting because why would the Chinese do this? It seems like the Chinese went through a lot of logistical nightmare. Like I can just sit there and imagine the flight crew just thinking how much of a nightmare this would have been logistically to hop all the way across the world to make this flight happen, just for American news media to talk about it for 30 minutes on the air and then just kind of ignore it. The Chinese did something special here if that's what they did. Again, big ifs all over this. This whole thing is dotted with huge ifs and assumptions. But I don't think they're that big of an assumption, and I think that this may be China's way of letting us know, hey, you thought you were out of range. But again, one of the main reasons why the United States dominates the Pacific is probably one of the better, military, in my opinion, one of the better military ideologies that we've had and lessons we've learned from World War II, which is, hey, the United States, we had better own this part of the world here, the Pacific. We better own every place where a bomber could land, and so on and so forth. But purely because of the range of the Chinese bombers. China is undoubtedly the America's biggest adversary in the Pacific. You may disagree with the United States pushing out our presence so far into the Pacific. I don't want to debate that because there's good arguments on either side of that. I'm just explaining to you why. Why do we have bases in the Philippines? Why do we have bases in Japan? Why do we still control Midway and Guam? And, why do we still do these things? Well, this is why. Because if China, let's see here. Let's see. If China, here's Guam. If China were to take Guam with their aircraft, we can see that the mainland is just within bombing range of Guam. So with bombs on board, could they do it? They'd be taking a less than standard load. I can tell you that for sure. They'd be flying a gas can out there to Guam to bomb it if they wanted to, which is why China has to take Taiwan, because from Taiwan, Guam is well within range, or not well within range, but just barely within range. Do you see why this kind of stuff is important to, or maybe interesting? Maybe not important for most people, but it's interesting to me because of this. So you can see that if the Chinese take Guam with their H-6s, assuming that they just use a standard variant, which in a case of war, they're not going to be flying around using their extreme long-range variant. Those extreme long-range variants are going to be used for nuclear weapons. The H-6Ks are going to be used for probably conventional munitions like cruise missiles or anti-ship cruise missiles or something like that. That's why China can dominate the South China Sea from where they're at. Let's just say one of the southern air bases down here. China can launch, and by the time they get, airborne, they can launch anti-ship cruise missiles at anything floating in this part of the world here. So you can see how nasty this can get. But in terms of attacking the American homeland, that's why people like me are not really concerned about the Chinese. However, in terms of this flight, again, it is one flight of 2 bombers who were probably loaded down with nothing but fuel tanks, or maybe they had some kind of internal fuel system. Either way, they're operating well outside of their homeland. They're operating well within our defenses, and they're operating well in our backyard. Either way, I think that assuming that China could not or would not launch a substantial sort of attack on the homeland, people like me who thought, well, it's just not militarily likely. Some people went further and said it's not militarily possible. Well, this proves that it's possible. And I think that it's gone from, my level of concern on this has gone from like mild to medium, you know what I mean? On this, it's not like, oh my gosh, this world is ending. But this is important. Like, this is a groundbreaking historical event, and I don't see very many people talking about it. So I thought that I would kind of share some of my ideas on and thoughts on this. Again, it's probably not that important, considering that there's this, but one of the things that kind of is groundbreaking is if China did, in fact, land in Russia and start forward deploying from a Russian base, well, now we have to change all of our doctrine, don't we? Because we now have to consider Russian bases to potentially house Chinese aircraft, which now increases China's range by a lot. Do you see where we're going? So, I don't know. I think that ignoring this would not be a wise idea by the Pentagon, but I'm sure they will. I'm sure some nerd out there at NORAD, NORTHCOM, or probably some naval command out there in the West in Alaska, I'm sure they're writing a very lengthy paper on this that no one will read. But I think it's important. And I think that it would probably be a good idea for the American public to keep this in mind as well. Is this a direct threat for you and your family tomorrow? No. But it's interesting. I can tell you that. It's interesting. Especially if China is now starting to use Russian air bases for something like this. The battle for the Arctic has definitely reached new heights, I think. So, but again, for most people, it probably wasn't interesting enough to talk about in the main brief for today. So, I thought I would separate it out and talk about this because, maybe I'm all wrong again. Maybe I just have gotten the ranges wrong on all these, and China can just fly a long way on their bombers. But I just don't think so. Unless they put fuel bladders in the bomb bay and, doubled their range, I don't think they took off from China. They would have had to have taken off from Russia, and that's probably the biggest lesson to take away from this is that China and Russia are now cooperating to the point to where Chinese bombers can take off from Russian bases, and they're familiarizing themselves with this. Like I said in the beginning, China and Russia diplomatically, they may not be getting along on everything, but they're getting along well enough to where Chinese bombers are becoming familiarized with Russian equipment, with Russian procedures. They all share the same equipment, really. But they're getting familiar, the value of a Chinese pilot knowing the procedures and getting the real world experience for landing at Ugolny, that pilot's now worth a lot of money. That pilot is now worth a lot because now he's familiar. He's landed at that airfield before. He's now got a higher chance of doing it in a state of duress. People really underestimate the ability of training. Someone who's familiar with a flight is now more valuable. So if China were to do this again, it's very likely that the PC or the pilot in command in one of these aircraft that went, if not the squadron leader, will probably go again because they're now familiar with the route of how to get up there. So something to keep in mind. Like I said, probably not interesting to a lot of people, but I thought I would talk about it anyway. So, let me know what you think. I guess this is really one of those things which is very debatable. It's all theoretical. We're all working off of old manuals from a long time ago because, we're not operating in the classified, sphere. So I'm sure that's, all, different. But still, we have a pretty good basis of understanding to work from. And I think that the bottom line thesis for this is that China would have had to have taken off from Russia. There ain't no way they took off from China. They would had to have staged at a base in Russia, either Ukrainka or what I think more likely Anadyr, in order to fly that far. So, at least with their standard bombers. So again, kind of an interesting tidbit. I think that it's going to be interesting because, as we all know from China, if they did it once, they're going to be doing it a lot. So this is something to keep in mind for when they do it next time. So that's all I've got on this. I'm probably going to immediately realize a point that I forgot to bring up the very minute that I turned the camera off, but still. But anyway, that's all I've got for now. Thank you for sticking around and putting up with my crazy theories. But sometimes it's interesting to kind of kick some of these ideas around and see what's possible. So thank you all for watching, and we will get back to it with the standard wire reports on Monday, and I guess we'll see you then. So as always, fight in the shade.